Sebastian Fundora did not just beat Keith Thurman. He made a statement that landed across the entire junior middleweight division, and the reaction afterward told you everything about how serious that statement was. This was not one of those nights where people leave the arena arguing over whether the winner looked good or whether the loser simply looked old. The overwhelming feeling after the fight was much simpler than that. Fundora looked like a real problem at 154 pounds, and Thurman looked like a man trying to come back into a division that has already moved on without him. That is the part that hurts if you have followed Keith Thurman for years. There was a time when he was one of the most explosive, confident, and watchable fighters in boxing. He had that mix of speed, power, timing, and swagger that made people believe he could beat anybody on the right night. But boxing is one of the cruelest sports in the world when it comes to time. Long layoffs matter. Injuries matter. Lost rhythm matters. And when you try to shake all of that off against someone as awkward, active, and physically unusual as Sebastian Fundora, the margin for error gets tiny in a hurry. From the moment the fight settled into its rhythm, Fundora looked like the man in control. He was not rushing recklessly, and he was not wasting motion. He was doing exactly what people who backed him hoped he would do. He used that absurd size, weight class, that endless reach, and that constant activity to make Thurman uncomfortable every minute he was in there. That is what makes Fundora so difficult. He is not just tall. If he were only tall, elite fighters would eventually solve him. The problem is that he knows how to make his height matter. He keeps the jab working. He throws in volume. He keeps opponents occupied, and he makes them feel like every second they spend trying to set something up is another second where he is already doing damage. A lot of the early reaction from fighters and analysts circled around exactly that point. Caleb Plant gave him credit for having a strong game plan, good coaching, and the confidence of a fighter who knows he is right in the middle of his prime. That felt like a fair read of what happened. Fundora did not look like a guy hoping his natural advantages would carry him. He looked like a fighter who understood the assignment, trusted the plan, and had the engine to keep executing it. That matters, because the best version of Fundora is not just some freakishly tall pressure fighter. The best version of Fundora is a guy who has started figuring out how to use all of his weirdness with discipline. That is where this performance becomes especially important. For a while, the conversation around Fundora was split between two extremes. One side saw him as a nightmare no one would want to fight because of his dimensions, chin, pace, and refusal to back off. The other side saw glaring flaws, especially after he had been hurt and stopped before, and believed the right puncher would expose him again. What this win over Thurman did was remind people that both things can be true. Yes, he has vulnerabilities, but he is also improving. And when a fighter with those dimensions starts making the right adjustments, the division gets very uncomfortable very quickly. Rolando Romero said it in his own chaotic way. But the basic point was impossible to miss. Fundora's size at this weight really does look absurd. He looks like someone who should be fighting in another division when he is standing across from a normal junior middleweight. The visual alone is disruptive, but what makes it even worse is that he is not passive with it. He does not just stand tall and hope the other guy freezes. He puts punches behind the physical advantage. He stays busy. He keeps touching you. He makes you work every second just to get inside. And then when you do get close enough to try something, he is still punching back. That is why Keith Thurman never really seemed to find comfort. He had moments where you could see what he wanted to do. He tried to move, tried to change levels, tried to work in some body shots, tried to stay elusive and make Fundora reset. But there was never a sustained stretch where it felt like he had solved the puzzle. He seemed caught between approaches. Too far out in Fundora's jab, reach, and activity were all over him. Too close, and Fundora still had enough volume and enough toughness to make the exchanges ugly for him. It felt like Thurman was searching for a fight that never arrived. That is what several people picked up on right away. Timothy Bradley was brutally honest, maybe even harsh, but not entirely wrong when he talked about what it means to return from inactivity and try to face a top guy in the division. Thurman had barely fought meaningful rounds over the last few years. You cannot manufacture sharpness in interviews. You cannot recreate timing by talking about old wins. At some point, you have to get in there. And when you have not been living in that fire consistently, it shows. Against a fighter like Fundora, it shows fast. Bradley's larger point was hard to ignore too. If Thurman had somehow pulled this off after all the inactivity, all the delays, all the setbacks, people probably would have spoken about it like a late career miracle. Instead, what we got was a reminder just how punishing the sport is to fighters who lose momentum. There is no mercy built into the schedule. Nobody gives you extra time because your body broke down or because injuries wrecked your timing. If anything, the next generation just keeps getting stronger while you are trying to get healthy. Roy Jones Jr. sounded more sympathetic, and his take probably captured the human side of the result best. He basically said what a lot of people were thinking. It is hard enough to come back after such a long layoff. It is even harder to do it against the top man in the division. There is no shame in finding out that the task was too much, but there is also no hiding from what happened. Fundora was too busy, too elusive in his own unusual way, and too persistent. Thurman was brave, but bravery alone was never going to be enough here. And that really is one of the defining qualities of Fundora. He is active in a way that wears fighters down mentally before it breaks them physically. Timothy Bradley described him almost like a relentless machine, a guy who keeps throwing and throwing and throwing until your resistance starts to fade. That is not elegant analysis, but it is accurate. Fundora makes people work at a pace that feels unnatural for the shape of the fight. You land a shot on him, and instead of giving you space to admire it, he answers with 3 or 4 more. You think you have bought yourself a quiet moment, and suddenly he is right back in front of you, touching you with the jab, leaning on the pace, and forcing you to make another decision. Richard Torres had one of the most interesting reactions because he spoke about something television does not fully capture. In person, Fundora's dimensions are even more bizarre. On screen, you know he is tall. From ringside, apparently, you feel just how strange the geometry of the fight becomes. A fighter that tall, with that kind of reach, pressing the action and still taking shots well enough to keep advancing, creates a very different kind of problem. It is not just the length. It is the fact that he combines it with aggression. Most guys that tall get lazy with it. Fundora seems to take it personally when you hit him and immediately tries to answer in bunches. That pressure was one of the biggest reasons a fight kept tilting his way. Thurman had some nice defensive looks at times. There were moments of head movement and lateral movement that reminded you of the older version of him, but he never built anything meaningful off those moments. He was defending in pieces, not fighting in layers. Fundora, on the other hand, was stacking pressure on top of pressure. Every round, he looked a little more settled. Every round, he looked a little more convinced that this was his night. And once a fighter like that starts feeling comfortable, things can get ugly fast. That is why the stoppage became such a talking point. Thurman was furious, insisting afterward that the referee did not do him justice and that he could have continued. He felt the fight was just getting to that dangerous, dramatic point where both men were ready to really go to war. From his perspective, he was still upright, still trying to work, still very much in it. Fighters almost always feel that way in the moment, and honestly, that competitiveness is part of what made Thurman who he was in the first place. But the other side of that conversation is hard to dismiss. Fundora had been dominating. Thurman was busted up. He was taking a beating. And the tide did not exactly look like it was about to turn. Teddy Atlas, who rarely hide behind safe opinions, basically said he understood both sides. He understood why some people disliked the stoppage, but he also understood why the referee felt safe ending it. When a fight is turned that one-sided, and the damaged fighter is no longer showing clear signs that he can reverse it, referees are going to err on the side of protection. That may not feel fair to the fighter in the moment, but it is part of the job. The bigger story, though, is not the stoppage. The bigger story is what this says about both men going forward. For Thurman, people are now asking the hardest question in boxing. Is there anything left at the top level? Not whether he can still fight. Of course he can still fight. The question is whether he can still compete with the best fighters in a strong division after everything his career has put him through. Some are already calling him a gatekeeper now. Others are saying it may be time to think seriously about retirement. That is a painful conversation for a fighter with the kind of resume he has. But it is the conversation the sport always forces on aging stars. And it is not as if the comments are coming from haters or random observers. They are coming from people who know how boxing works. When analysts start saying that some of the older names are reaching the point where top-tier success is no longer realistic, it is not meant as disrespect. It is recognition of what the ring usually tells us long before fighters want to hear it. Age is undefeated, inactivity is brutal, and punishment adds up. At the same time, there is no need to diminish Fundora's performance by turning the whole night into a eulogy for Thurman. That would be unfair. Fundora did not win because Thurman was old. He won because he fought an excellent fight. He used the jab beautifully. He controlled distance. He set the tempo. He kept the pressure going. He looked comfortable in his identity. He looked like a fighter who is learning exactly what kind of monster he can be when he uses his gifts properly. That deserves real credit. A lot of the post-fight discussion naturally turned toward the rest of the division. Can anyone at 154 really handle him right now? Caleb Plant said Fundora has the most momentum. Teddy Atlas said it is not out of the question that he can beat anybody. Others have called him a unicorn, an outlier, a nightmare-style matchup. Those descriptions are dramatic, but you can see why they keep coming up. Fundora does not fit cleanly into the normal logic of the division. Triangle theories do not help much with him because his size, style, and pressure create a different fight for every opponent. That is why the names people are throwing out next are so interesting. Virgil Ortiz keeps coming up. So does the possibility of appearing on a major card later in the year. Xander Zayas is another name floating in the background as the division keeps shifting. And every possible matchup comes with the same question. Who is actually equipped to deal with Fundora's length, his chin, his pace, and the increasing confidence behind all of it? Not just on paper, but in the real chaos of a live fight. That is also why some voices are warning against overreaction, even while praising him. One good win does not make a fighter unbeatable, just like one bad loss does not make a fighter finished. Styles matter. Timing matters. Matchups matter. But even if you take the measured view, it is impossible to ignore where Fundora stands right now. He is one of the hottest names in the division. He is improving. He is confident. He is physically miserable to deal with. And now, he has another meaningful win over a former champion on his record. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a very clear divide. Keith Thurman walked into this fight hoping experience, timing, toughness, and veteran craft would carry him through one more big moment. Instead, he ran into a fighter who looks like he is getting better at exactly the wrong time for everyone else at 154. Sebastian Fundora did not just defend his status, he strengthened it. He showed that the version of him people fear may be the version that is arriving right now. And that is the real headline after all the reactions, all the sympathy for Thurman, all the debate about the stoppage, and all the questions about what comes next. Sebastian Fundora is no longer just a weird, tall problem in the division. He is becoming a complete problem. He has momentum, confidence, experience, and a style nobody can comfortably prepare for. On this night, he looked every bit like a man ready to chase the biggest fights available. For Keith Thurman, this may be the fight that forces serious reflection. For Sebastian Fundora, it may be the fight that confirms he has truly arrived.